The silence was the first thing he noticed. It was not a peaceful silence, not the quiet hum of a sleeping house, but a hollow, predatory thing. It was the silence of a space that had been violently emptied of its sound, its warmth, its life. Leo stood in the doorway of the small home he had poured his sweat into, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint still clinging to his work clothes, and knew with a certainty that settled like a block of ice in his gut that something was fundamentally wrong. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, then you will understand the profound and terrible stillness of that moment, the point from which all other moments would be measured. It was the end of one life and the brutal, unasked-for beginning of another. He walked through the living room, his steel-toed boots making no sound on the rug they had picked out together. His gaze swept the room, cataloguing the absences. Clara's collection of porcelain birds was gone from the mantelpiece. The stack of glossy fashion magazines she always left on the coffee table had vanished. The air, usually thick with the scent of her jasmine perfume, smelled only of lemon polish and a faint, lingering cold. It felt less like a home and more like a stage that had been struck. The actors departed, leaving behind only the shell of a story. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a man inspecting a potentially unstable structure, testing the ground before committing his weight. In the kitchen, he saw it. A single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the expensive kind she bought for thank-you notes she rarely wrote, was placed dead center on the granite countertop he had spent 3 weekends installing. It was held in place not by a magnet or a piece of fruit, but by the stark, insolent weight of her wedding ring, the simple gold band, the one he had placed on her finger, with hands still rough from framing the neighbor's deck, now served as an anchor for his own ruin. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its precision. It was not a thoughtless abandonment. It was a statement, calculated and clean. His hands felt clumsy and thick as he reached for the paper, his calloused fingers fumbling against its smooth surface. He lifted the ring first, its familiar weight feeling alien and cold in his palm. It was just a circle of metal, yet it contained the entire architecture of his life, a life now condemned. He set it down carefully as if it might explode, and unfolded the note. The handwriting was hers, a flamboyant looping script that always seemed to be performing for an audience. "Leo," it began, devoid of any affection. "I can't do this anymore. I need more than this. I need a life, a real life, not just building things." The words felt like a physical blow. He had built this house for her. He was building a career for them. His entire existence was a project of construction, and she had just dismissed it as a hobby. "I've met someone. His name is Marcus Thorne. You might have heard of him. Thorne Development. He has real ambition, Leo. He has real money. He can give me the world you only ever promised to draw on a blueprint. I'm sorry for the mess, but I have to go. Please don't try to find me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He read the note 3 times, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. Marcus Thorne. The name was a billboard, a monument to everything Leo was not. Thorne built glass towers that scraped the sky, while Leo built extensions and renovated kitchens. Thorne drove a Maserati. Leo drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup with a perpetually rattling tailgate. Thorne wore tailored suits that probably cost more than Leo's monthly mortgage payment. He was the finished product. Leo was the raw material. And then came the final, devastating, load-bearing sentence, a postscript tucked at the bottom like an afterthought. "P.S. Lily will need you. I know you'll take care of her. You're good at that." The note slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. Lily? Clara's younger sister? They had taken her in 6 months ago after her life had spiraled, a whirlwind of bad choices and worse company. She was 19, fragile, and just starting to put the pieces of herself back together under their roof. Clara hadn't just abandoned her husband, she had abandoned her own sister, leaving her behind like a piece of forgotten luggage. The secondary burden. The responsibility was now his alone, a sudden crushing weight added to the rubble of his marriage. He looked around the silent, empty kitchen. The chill in the air was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical presence, seeping into his bones. He was alone, in a house that was no longer a home, left with the ghost of a promise and the care of a broken girl. The silence pressed in, and for the first time in his life, Leo felt the terrifying sensation of the ground giving way beneath his feet. The days that followed were a blur of muted grey, a landscape of autopilot functionality. He got up, he went to work, he came home. He existed in the spaces between actions, a ghost haunting his own life. The smell of concrete dust and welding fumes became his only comfort, a gritty perfume that clung to him and masked the scent of jasmine he sometimes still imagined in the empty house. At the construction site, he was Foreman Leo, a man of quiet competence who could solve a problem with a spirit level and a piece of chalk. He poured his grief and rage into the physical labor, swinging a sledgehammer with a fury that made the younger men nervous, his muscles screaming a language his mouth could not speak. The pain was clean, honest. It was a relief. At home, he was just Leo, a hollowed-out man moving through rooms that felt too big, too quiet. The house became a reflection of his internal state, chaotic, neglected. Take-out boxes formed precarious towers on the kitchen counter. Laundry, a mix of his work clothes and Lily's hoodies, overflowed the baskets, a mountain of unfaced chores. He would sit on the edge of the bed they had once shared, the indentation of her body still a phantom presence on the mattress, and stare at the wall until the patterns in the plaster began to swim. He was a builder whose own foundation had been dynamited. What did you do when the blueprint for your life had been set on fire? Lily was the quiet, watchful presence in the house. She moved like a skittish deer, her eyes wide and shadowed with a hurt that mirrored his own. She tried. She would clean the kitchen in small, timid bursts, or leave a plate of badly microwaved food on the table for him when he got home late. They spoke in short, functional sentences. Need anything from the store? No. Did you eat? Later. They were two survivors sharing a life raft, too exhausted and shell-shocked to do more than paddle in their own separate, silent rhythms. He saw the guilt in her eyes, as if she were somehow responsible for her sister's desertion, and he saw the fear. She had been abandoned twice now, and the terror of it made her almost translucent. He was failing her. He knew it. He was supposed to be the adult, the steady hand, but he was drowning, and the effort to keep his own head above water left little energy for anything else. The bills started to pile up on the counter, where Clara's note had been, a stack of white-windowed envelopes that seemed to mock him with their demands. His paycheck, which had once felt substantial for the two of them, now seemed to evaporate before it even hit the bank. He was operating in a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, the hum of it a constant companion beneath the surface of his thoughts. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally, a structure worn down by stress fractures, one heavy blow away from total collapse. The breaking point, when it came, was not a grand, dramatic explosion. It was a small, quiet implosion. It was a Tuesday night, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Rain lashed against the windows. He was hunched over the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of paperwork. It was for Lily's community college application. She wanted to study architecture, a fact that struck him with a brutal, beautiful irony. She wanted to build just like him. He was trying to navigate the labyrinthine financial aid forms, his brain thick with fatigue. He needed their last bank statement. He logged into the online portal, the numbers on the screen glowing with an eerie light in the dim kitchen. He navigated to the account summary, his eyes scanning for the familiar balance, the modest but steady cushion they had built. And then he saw it. The number was so small, so utterly wrong that for a moment he thought it was a typo. $17.38. He clicked on the transaction history, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs like a loose stud in a wall frame. He saw his last paycheck deposit, and then he saw the withdrawal, 2 days after she left. The entire balance, save for a few dollars. Clara. She had not only left him, she had pillaged him, taking the last of their shared resources, the emergency fund, the money for the property taxes, the buffer that kept them from the edge. She had taken it all. He was holding his tablet, the one Lily had given him for his last birthday. His hand was trembling. The sheer, calculated callousness of the act was what broke him. It wasn't just leaving, it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the active, deliberate act of sabotage. It was kicking the ladder out from under him after pushing him into the pit. A sound escaped his throat, a choked, guttural noise that was not a word. The tablet slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the tiled floor with a sickening crack, the sound sharp and final in the oppressive silence of the house. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 fractured lines. He didn't bend to pick it up. He just stared at the shattered device on the floor, a perfect, crystalline metaphor for everything his life had become. And then the strength went out of his legs. He didn't fall so much as fold, sinking down onto the cold, hard tiles of the kitchen floor he had laid himself. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to hold himself together as the world came apart. There were no tears. There was no scream. There was only the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute failure, a silence more profound and terrifying than any sound he had ever known. He had hit rock bottom, and the ground was cold and unforgiving. He did not know how long he sat there on the floor, a man disassembled. Time had ceased to function in any meaningful way. The rain continued its relentless assault on the house, each drop a tiny hammer against the roof. He was only dimly aware of a presence, a shift in the air. He looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. Lily was standing in the doorway, a frayed, oversized blanket clutched in her hands. There was no panic in her face, no alarm, only a deep, ancient sadness that seemed too heavy for her young features. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew the shape of ruin. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the tiles, and gently draped the blanket over his shoulders. Then she slid down the kitchen cabinets and sat on the floor beside him, not touching, not speaking, just sharing the cold, hard space. Her quiet, unwavering presence was a lighthouse in his personal storm. In her stillness, he saw a resilience that shamed his own collapse. She, who had been abandoned by her mother and now her sister, was not broken. She was waiting for him. He looked at her, this girl who was not his daughter but was now his charge, this piece of Clara's life that she had discarded so carelessly, and a profound, seismic shift occurred deep within him. The self-pity that had been his constant companion curdled into something else. It became resolve. He could not sink. Not while she was watching. He had to build. He had to build a world for her, for them, from the ground up, with whatever broken tools he had left. He had to become the foundation she could stand on. The decision settled over him, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, dense certainty of setting concrete. He would not be a victim. He would be an architect. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one that seemed to fill his lungs in weeks, and the air tasted of rain and dust and a future he would have to construct one brick at a time. The first step was an act of sacrifice. The next morning he made a phone call. His voice was hoarse but steady. He was selling the Mustang. The 1968 Highland Green Fastback was more than a car. It was a testament, a piece of his history. He and his father had spent 5 years restoring it, their hands covered in grease, their conversations weaving through the language of carburetors and camshafts. It was the last tangible piece of his father he had left. Selling it felt like an amputation. But sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford. The cash from the sale was a lifeline. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to pay the overdue bills, to secure their small house for a few more months, and, most importantly, to write a check for the first semester of Lily's tuition at the community college. When he handed it to her, her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in months, he felt the solid, satisfying feeling of having built something, however small, that was stable and true. At work, a new kind of challenge presented itself. Her name was Elena Vance. She was the new site architect for the Henderson project, a complex commercial build that was already behind schedule. She was sharp, with eyes that missed nothing and a way of speaking that was clipped and precise, leaving no room for interpretation. She walked the site in pristine hard hat and steel-toed boots that looked like they had been purchased that morning, a clipboard her shield and scepter. To Leo and his crew, she was an intruder, a white-collar idealist who understood lines on a page, but not the realities of mud and steel and human error. Their initial interactions were a series of minor skirmishes. She would point out a rebar cage that was a quarter-inch off-spec. He would patiently explain that the ground had settled overnight, and it would be corrected before the pour. She would question his timeline. He would calmly detail the supply chain delays she couldn't see from her air-conditioned office. He saw her as an obstacle. She, he assumed, saw him as a stubborn, uncooperative foreman, a relic of an older, less precise way of doing things. The inevitable conflict came during the inspection of the third-floor support columns. A flaw was discovered, a hairline fracture in one of the primary beams, a potentially catastrophic failure point. An immediate stop work order was issued. Panic, quiet and professional, rippled through the site. Elena's firm, the prestigious architectural house of Sterling and Crow, immediately pointed the finger at the execution. They claimed Leo's team had used an improper concrete mix or had failed to cure it correctly. It was a classic case of the designers blaming the builders. His job, and the reputation of Henderson Construction, was on the line. Their boss, Mr. Henderson, a man whose face was a roadmap of deadlines and frustrations, called a meeting. It was tense. The Sterling and Crow representatives were slick and defensive. Elena was there, her face pale and set. They laid out their case, armed with charts and material specifications. Then it was Leo's turn. He hadn't brought charts. He brought a piece of chalk and a roll of the original blueprints. He spoke quietly, his voice devoid of the anger and panic that was thick in the room. He didn't defend, he explained. He walked them through the pour logs, the temperature readings, the slump tests. Every data point was perfect. Then he unrolled the blueprints on the large table. With the chalk, he began to draw on the floor, not on the plans. He drew the support structure as it was designed. Then he drew the actual load distribution, factoring in the subtle, almost imperceptible cantilever of the adjoining floor. He used his deep, intuitive, hands-on knowledge of how materials behave under stress, a knowledge that couldn't be learned in a classroom. "The flaw isn't in the concrete," he said, his voice resonating with the calm authority of truth. He pointed to a nexus of lines on the blueprint. "It's here. In the transfer of the load, there's a sheer stress concentration that the original models didn't account for. The fracture isn't a failure of our work. It's the building telling us the design is wrong." Silence descended on the room. The Sterling and Crow suits looked flustered, shuffling their papers. Mr. Henderson stared at the chalk, drawing on the floor, then at Leo, a new respect dawning in his tired eyes. But it was Elena's reaction that he noticed. She wasn't looking at her bosses or at Henderson. She was looking at him. Her expression was not defensive or angry. It was one of intense, unadulterated focus. She walked over to the blueprints, then knelt down to examine his chalk drawing, her fingers tracing the lines he had made. She saw it. She understood. She stood up and faced her own team. "He's right," she said, her voice clear and firm. The admission hung in the air, a stunning break from the usual dance of blame. Later that day, after the suits had retreated to strategize, she found him by the rebar cages, the sun setting behind the skeletal frame of the building. "You saved us all today," she said, her tone stripped of its earlier professional chill. "My firm, Henderson, all of it. I'm sorry, I misjudged you." "We're all just trying to make the building stand up straight," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Some of us are better at it than others," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips for the first time. "You don't just build, you understand, there's a difference." In that moment, a new structure began to form between them, not of concrete and steel, but of something far more rare and valuable: mutual respect. The foundation had been laid. The next 5 years were a testament to the power of the long game. They were not a montage of quick successes, but a slow, arduous grind, a day-by-day, brick-by-brick construction of a new life. The passage of time was marked not in holidays or birthdays, but in completed projects, in semesters finished, in the gradual easing of the crushing weight that had once threatened to bury him. He lived his life by a new blueprint, one of his own design, built on the principles of discipline, patience, and relentless forward motion. His transformation began in the dim light of a library carrel, the smell of old paper, and stale coffee replacing the scent of sawdust. He enrolled in night classes at the same community college Lily attended. He started with construction management, then moved on to structural engineering and business law. The world of contracts and liability, of tensile strength and cost analysis, which had once been the abstract domain of men in suits, began to reveal its logic to him. He discovered he had a mind for it, a natural aptitude for seeing the entire structure, not just the individual beams. The calluses on his hands softened, replaced by a new kind of hardness in his gaze, a focused intensity that saw problems not as obstacles, but as equations to be solved. Elena became his unlikely tutor, his partner in this intellectual ascent. Their late-night study sessions, initially held over drafting tables littered with blueprints, evolved. They would meet in quiet diners, the air thick with the smell of frying bacon, and argue over load-bearing calculations and zoning variances. She pushed him, challenging his assumptions, forcing him to defend his practical knowledge with theoretical rigor. In turn, he gave her a grounding in the messy reality of construction, a feel for the materials that she could not get from a computer model. He taught her the language of the job site, the shorthand of grunts and gestures that communicated more than a 1,000-page manual. They were two halves of a whole, the architect and the builder, and their professional symbiosis began to bleed into something deeper, something more personal. Mr. Henderson, who had seen scores of men come and go, watched Leo's slow, steady climb with a gruff, proprietary pride. He saw the fire in him, the quiet, unshakable grit. He started giving him more responsibility, moving him from foreman to site manager, then to a project manager overseeing multiple builds. He took Leo under his wing, mentoring him in the brutal art of the business, the negotiations, the politics, the delicate dance of managing expectations and budgets. "You got a good head on your shoulders, Leo," he'd grumble, handing him a thick contract. "Don't just build the damn thing, own the damn thing." The words planted a seed. Leo's physical appearance changed with his role. The worn work shirts and dusty jeans were gradually replaced by pressed collars and tailored jackets. He still wore boots, but now they were polished leather, equally at home on a muddy site or a polished boardroom floor. A few threads of silver appeared at his temples, a distinguished counterpoint to the new confidence in his bearing. He was no longer just a man who worked with his hands. He was a man who commanded, who directed, who built empires of concrete and steel. The romance with Elena was a slow burn, a fire built with the patient care of an expert, starting with the smallest kindling of shared respect and slowly adding the fuel of shared experience. There was no single moment of declaration, but a series of quiet acknowledgements. A lingering touch over a set of blueprints, a shared look of triumph as a difficult project was completed. The easy silence that settled between them on the long drives home from a distant site. He found in her a loyalty that was as solid and dependable as bedrock. She saw not the broken man he had been, but the formidable man he was becoming. Their first kiss happened on a cold, clear night on the unfinished roof of a building they had fought for, the city lights sprawling beneath them like a field of scattered diamonds. It was not a kiss of passionate desperation, but of quiet, profound recognition. They were partners. They were building something together. During these years of ascent, Lily was his anchor and his inspiration. She thrived. With the stability he provided and the mentorship Elena offered, she excelled in her studies. She graduated at the top of her class, her final project a brilliant, innovative design for a sustainable urban community center. She took a job with a prestigious firm in the city, her own career beginning its upward trajectory. She was no longer the fragile, broken girl he had inherited, but a confident, capable young woman. She was his first and most important project, the living proof that something beautiful and strong could be built from the ruins. After 7 years, the transformation was complete. Henderson Construction, facing Mr. Henderson's impending retirement, was restructured. It became Henderson Stone Construction, with Leo, whose full name was Leo Stone, as a full partner. He had not just built the thing, he now owned the thing. He and Elena moved out of the small, haunted house of his past and into a stunning, minimalist home they had designed and built together on a piece of land overlooking a quiet lake. It was a house of glass and steel and warm wood, a place of light and openness, the architectural antithesis of the dark, cramped space where his old life had ended. He had arrived, but he never forgot the feel of the cold kitchen floor, the memory, a permanent, invisible blueprint in the back of his mind, a reminder of the cost of failure and the true value of what he had built. The first whispers of Marcus Thorne's downfall came not as a roar, but as a series of quiet, almost imperceptible tremors in the financial pages. A delayed project, a lawsuit from an investor, rumors of over-leveraged assets. Leo followed the news with a detached, clinical interest, the way a structural engineer might observe the slow, inevitable collapse of a poorly designed building. Thorne had built his empire on a foundation of debt and illusion, a glittering facade with nothing solid behind it. When the market shifted, when the first real pressures were applied, the entire edifice began to crumble. The news of the indictment was a headline splash. Developer Marcus Thorne charged with fraud, embezzlement. The glass towers he had built were revealed to be monuments to his own hubris, financed with other people's money, much of which had simply vanished. His assets were frozen. The Maserati was repossessed. The high society galas and charity balls where he and Clara had been photographed, their smiles gleaming with superficial triumph, were a distant memory. He was facing years in prison, and Clara, who had attached herself to his rising star, was now caught in the gravitational pull of his collapse. She was left with nothing but a wardrobe of expensive clothes, a collection of useless, empty jewelry boxes, and the bitter taste of a bad investment. Leo felt nothing, no satisfaction, no schadenfreude. It was simply the logical conclusion of a flawed design. He was too busy. Henderson Stone was in the middle of its most ambitious project yet, the Sentinel Tower, a skyscraper that would redefine the city's skyline. It was his vision, his project, a complex, breathtaking piece of engineering and artistry that consumed his days and nights. His life was full. He had Elena, their partnership a seamless blend of personal and professional. He had Lily, now a rising star in her own right, who often consulted on their projects. He had built a world so solid, so real, that the ghosts of his past had no place to haunt. Or so he thought. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn. A cool wind rustled the leaves of the oak trees surrounding their house. He and Elena were in their kitchen, a space of clean lines and warm under-cabinet lighting, going over the revised schematics for the Sentinel's lobby. The aroma of Elena's spicy chili simmered on the stove. It was a scene of domestic and professional harmony, so complete it felt almost sacred. The doorbell chimed, a sound so rare it was startling. They weren't expecting anyone. Leo went to the door. Through the frosted glass panel, he could see the silhouette of a woman, thin and hunched against the evening chill. He opened the door, a polite, "Can I help you?" on his lips. The words died in his throat. It was Clara. The intervening years had not been kind. She was gaunt, the expensive but ill-fitting coat hanging off her sharp shoulders. Her face, once vibrant and glowing with a pampered sheen, was pale and drawn, the lines of stress and desperation etched around her eyes and mouth. The flamboyant confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. She looked like a cheap imitation of the woman she used to be. "Leo," she breathed, her voice a dry rasp. She tried for a smile, a pathetic, trembling thing that didn't reach her haunted eyes. I was just in the neighborhood. I heard about all your success. I wanted to see you." He stood there, a silent sentinel in the doorway of the life he had built without her. He felt a profound and unsettling sense of dislocation, as if a character from a long-forgotten bad dream had suddenly materialized in his living room. He could smell her perfume, a different scent now, cheaper, sweeter, but it still carried the same cloying undertone of artifice. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice he used to address a failing subcontractor. Her facade of casualness crumbled, her eyes welled up with tears, a performance of remorse he recognized all too well. "Oh, Leo," she sobbed, her hand fluttering to her chest. "I made such a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. I was young, I was foolish. He promised me everything, but it was all lies. Every day for 7 years I've thought about you, about what we had, about this." Her gesture took in the beautiful house, the successful man standing before her, everything she had thrown away. It was a plea for pity, a desperate attempt to rewind time, to find a foothold in the life she had so carelessly abandoned. But he was no longer the man she had left. That man had died on a cold kitchen floor 7 years ago. The man standing before her now was a different creature entirely, one she could not possibly comprehend. He had been built to withstand this exact kind of storm. He stood impassive in the doorway, a bulwark of quiet strength against her tide of manufactured emotion. The sight of her tears, once a weapon that could disarm him completely, now registered with all the emotional impact of a weather report. He saw the performance for what it was, a tactic. She was not grieving a lost love, she was mourning a lost opportunity. His silence seemed to unnerve her more than any angry outburst would have. The sobs hitched, and a flicker of her old impatience showed in her eyes. "Aren't you going to invite me in, Leo?" she asked, her voice tinged with a faint, residual echo of the entitlement she used to wear like a second skin. "It's cold out here." "No," he said. The single word was not cruel, just a statement of fact. It was a closed door, a finished project. From behind him, Eleanor appeared, a quiet, solid presence at his side. She didn't say a word, simply placed a hand on the small of his back. Her touch was an anchor, a reminder of the present, of the real. Clara's eyes darted to Elena, then to their intertwined hands, and a new expression, ugly and sharp, twisted her features. It was the look of a thwarted investor seeing her stock option awarded to someone else. The pity play had failed. It was time for the next phase of her strategy. "I see," Clara said, her voice losing its pathetic tremble and gaining a hard, metallic edge. "You've replaced me. How efficient of you, Leo, but you can't just erase me. You can't erase what we had." "There's nothing left to erase," Leo said, his voice still level. "You took care of that yourself. You need to leave." The desperation in her eyes hardened into a glint of malice. "I don't think so," she said, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You and I have unfinished business. You seem to have forgotten a small, inconvenient detail. We're still married, Leo. In the eyes of the law, we are still husband and wife." She let the words hang in the air, a threat wrapped in a legal truth. "And this beautiful house, your successful company, I believe the term is community property. Half of it is mine. I made a mistake leaving, I admit it. But I'm back now and I'm ready to claim what's mine." It was the escalation he had distantly academically anticipated. When the appeal to sentiment failed, she would resort to leverage. She was attempting to blackmail him with their shared past, to lay claim to a future she had no hand in building. She saw his life not as something he had painstakingly constructed from ruin, but as a lottery ticket she had misplaced and just found in an old coat pocket. "You think you can just show up after 7 years and make demands?" he asked, a flicker of cold anger finally stirring beneath his calm exterior. "I'm not demanding, darling, I'm stating a fact," she retorted, a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She believed she had him. She believed she had found the stress fracture in his new life, the one point of weakness she could exploit to bring the whole structure crashing down. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice. But either way, I'm getting my share." She turned to leave, her exit line delivered, believing she had won the scene. "Clara," he said, his voice stopping her in her tracks. "Let's not involve lawyers just yet. It gets expensive. Meet me tomorrow, noon, the Oak Haven bar. We can talk about this like adults." She turned back, a look of surprise and then cunning on her face. He was willing to negotiate. She had him on the ropes. "Fine," she said. "Noon. Don't be late." She walked away, her steps lighter, her shoulders straighter. She was already spending the money in her head. Leo closed the door and leaned his forehead against the cool wood. He took a deep breath, the scent of Eleanor's chili and the faint, clean smell of their home filling his lungs, chasing away the last lingering trace of Clara's cheap perfume. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft with concern. She was studying his face, her analytical eyes reading the subtle shifts in his expression. He turned to face her, a grim, determined light in his eyes. "I am," he said, and it was the truth. He was not shaken. He was not afraid. He was prepared. "She's making a mistake. She's trying to fight a war she can't win because she doesn't even understand the battlefield." He looked at Eleanor, at the unwavering loyalty and trust in her eyes, and felt a surge of cold, clear certainty. "She thinks she's found a weakness, but all she's found is a trap I set 7 years ago." The Oak Haven bar was a place of dark wood, worn leather, and hushed conversations. It was a neutral ground, a place for deals and confessions. Leo chose a booth in the back, the deep shadows providing a sense of privacy. He arrived 10 minutes early. He was not alone. Elena sat beside him, a presence, a silent statement of solidarity. She was not there to speak, but to bear witness. She had insisted. "We built this life together, Leo," she had said that morning. "We will defend it together." Clara arrived at 12:15, a calculated power move to make him wait. She had made an effort with her appearance. Her hair was freshly done, her makeup meticulously applied to hide the desperation. She wore a dress that was likely one of the last vestiges of her life with Thorne. She slid into the booth opposite them, her eyes flicking to Elena with disdain before settling on Leo. "Bringing your replacement to our private negotiation?" she began, her voice dripping with scorn. "That's a bold move, Leo." "Eleanor is not your replacement," Leo said calmly, his hands resting on the table. "She is my partner. There's a difference." "She's here because there are no secrets between us," Clara scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Fine, let's cut to the chase. I've had a night to think. I've been generous. I could take you to court, drag your name through the mud for years. But I'm willing to settle a clean break, 50% of your shares in Henderson Stone, this house, and 50% of all liquid assets. It's a fair offer. It's what I'm owed." She leaned back, her arms crossed, the picture of smug certainty. She had laid out her terms. She believed she held all the cards. Leo listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he took a slow sip of his water. He did not look angry. He did not look worried. He looked like a man reviewing a flawed blueprint, his mind several steps ahead of the conversation. "That is a bold offer, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. "But it's predicated on a fundamental error in your calculations." He reached into the briefcase that was resting on the seat beside him and pulled out a thin leather folder. He slid it across the table. "You should look at this." Clara eyed the folder with suspicion, then opened it. Inside was a single, notarized document. She read it, her brow furrowing in confusion. She read it again, her face slowly losing its color. "What is this? I don't understand." "It's a copy of our final divorce decree," Leo explained, his voice as calm and steady as a surveyor's level. "Dated 5 years ago, I filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment and desertion 1 year after you left. Since your whereabouts were unknown, and since you had made it clear you didn't want to be found, my lawyer arranged for service by publication. You had 30 days to respond. You didn't. The divorce was granted by default. We haven't been married for half a decade, Clara." The smugness on her face evaporated, replaced by a stunned, gaping disbelief. "No, that's not possible. You couldn't have." "I did," he said. "It was one of the first things I did when I decided to start rebuilding. You can't build a new structure on a compromised foundation. I had to clear the site first. The metaphor, so central to his life, was lost on her. She was still reeling from the shock. "So this is all for nothing," she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. "My claim—" "You have no claim," he stated, the words like steel nails hammered into a coffin. "Everything I have, everything Henderson Stone has become, was built after our legal separation, the house, the partnership, the investments. You are not entitled to any of it. You abandoned the project before the foundation was even poured." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process the totality of her defeat. The house of cards she had built in her mind, her grand plan for retribution and recovery, had just been blown away by a single, quiet fact. But Leo wasn't finished. He had one more piece of the structure to put in place. "But you know, Clara," he continued, his voice softening slightly, taking on a tone of almost academic curiosity. "The most ironic part of all this, the part that I think you'll truly appreciate, is that you were wrong from the very beginning." He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a second, thicker folder. He didn't slide this one across, he just held it. "You left me because you wanted real money. You left me for Marcus Thorne because he had a visible, flashy empire, and I was just a foreman with dirty hands. You saw his glass tower and you saw my two-bedroom house, and you made a choice based on what you could see." He opened the folder. Inside were trust documents, portfolio statements, legal correspondence. "This is the estate of my parents, Robert and Eleanor Stone. You remember them, quiet people, a retired teacher and a librarian. They lived in a small house, drove an old car. You thought they were sweet, but simple." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "My parents weren't simple, Clara. They were brilliant. They were disciplined, patient investors. They lived modestly, but they built a fortune, slowly, quietly, over 50 years. When my father passed away 2 years before you left, he left me as the sole beneficiary of a trust, a significant one. But the terms were specific. I couldn't access the principal until my 35th birthday." He looked her dead in the eye. "My 35th birthday was on October 12th, 6 months after you walked out." Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The implications of his words crashed down on her like a tidal wave. "I knew about the money," Leo said, his voice a near whisper. "I knew it was coming, but I never told you. Not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't matter. It wasn't who I was. I wanted to build something myself. I wanted a partner who valued the builder, not the bank account. When you left and I hit the bottom, I made a promise to myself. I would not touch a single cent of that trust. I would build my life, my company, with my own 2 hands and my own mind. And I did. Henderson Stone, the house Elena and I designed, every single thing you see and covet. I built it all from nothing, from the $17.38 you left me in our bank account." He finally slid the folder across the table. "The trust is still there, untouched, growing. It's more than Thorne ever had, even at his peak. And it's real, the kind of money that lasts because it was built slowly, patiently, without flash or ego." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even further, a final, surgical incision. "You left me for a man with real money, Clara, but you were already living with one. You just didn't have the eyes to see it. You were looking for a finished skyscraper, and you couldn't see the value in a solid foundation." She stared at the folder, then at him, her face a mask of utter devastation. It was not the loss of the money that destroyed her in that moment. It was the crushing, irreversible knowledge of her own spectacular, life-altering misjudgment. She had traded a mountain of solid gold for a handful of glitter. Her entire life had been a bet on the wrong horse, and she had just been shown the winning ticket she had torn up and thrown away. She had no leverage, no claim, no pity, and now no illusions. She was utterly, completely, and finally defeated, not by his rage, but by the quiet, unassailable truth. Clara didn't say another word. She simply folded. Like a building whose key supports had been simultaneously vaporized, she just collapsed inward. Her shoulders slumped. Her head bowed. The fight, the malice, the desperate hope, it all drained out of her, leaving an empty, brittle shell. She pushed the folders back across the table without looking at them, a gesture of complete and final surrender. Then she slid out of the booth, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated, and walked out of the bar, a ghost, fading back into the obscurity from which she had emerged. He watched her go, and the feeling that washed over him was not the hot, satisfying rush of triumph he might have once fantasized about. It was something cleaner, lighter. It was peace. It was the quiet, profound relief of a project finally, truly completed. A decade-long weight had been lifted from his soul, and he felt light enough to float. He turned and looked at Elena. She had watched the entire exchange with a quiet, fierce intensity. Her eyes, which could read the complex language of a structural analysis with a single glance, were now fixed on him, filled with a depth of understanding and love that was the real foundation of his life. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers twining with his. Her touch was warm and solid, real. "Let's go home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was more than love, more than gratitude. It was the feeling of being truly, completely seen. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's go home." The drive back to their house was quiet, the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate the most important things. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. When they got home, he didn't go inside. Instead, he led Elena around to the back, to the wide deck that overlooked the calm, glassy surface of the lake. The air was crisp and clean. He stood there for a long time, just breathing, letting the peace of the place seep into him, washing away the last residual grime of the past. He had vanquished the ghost. He had closed the loop. But the victory felt secondary, an administrative task that had needed completing. The real prize was this: the quiet evening, the solid deck beneath his feet, the warm, loyal presence of the woman beside him. This was the empire, the rest, the company, the money, the skyscraper that was now climbing toward the clouds, was just the scaffolding that supported it. They stood there until the last of the light had faded and the first stars began to prick the dark velvet of the sky. From the city in the distance, a single, bright red light pulsed steadily at the top of a skeletal structure that reached higher than anything else around it. The Sentinel. Their Sentinel. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. He looked from the blinking red light of his professional triumph to the woman who was the architect of his personal peace. He thought of Lily, now a successful young woman building her own life, a life he had helped stabilize. He thought of the house they stood in, a place of light and love. He had started with nothing but rubble and a promise to a scared young girl. He had built all this, not from the trust fund he had never needed, but from the grit and determination he had discovered within himself. The true success was not in the money he had, but in the man he had been forced to become. He wrapped his arm around Elena, pulling her closer, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his side. The past was a closed book, a finished blueprint filed away in the archives. The future was an open city waiting to be built. "We have work to do tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a new, lighter sense of purpose. It was not a statement of burden, but one of promise. The building never stopped, and for the first time in a very long time, he was excited to see what they would build next.